My name is Chris Harnish. I want to start by thanking Jefferson, the Med Studio, Peter Lloyd Jones, and Trudy for getting this whole thing started today. I was going to, here we go. So, oop. Yep. Okay, swipe left. Yeah, there we go. I wanted to give a little bit of a background on my work and then start talking more specifically about what we see when we think about work in Africa. What's the designer's role, and then how may it be done? I am trying a bit of a new presentation here today that talks a little bit more about the philosophical background of people from the global north, the US and Europe in particular, working in Africa, and what is our role and how we do that. There are too many times that I just sort of sit here and present my work, and then I walk out afterwards and I sort of hear the same challenged or maybe not so greatly informed perspectives from the north regarding the south. And so rather than just talk about my work, I wanted to talk about some of the philosophical underpinnings of it. And in order to do so, I wanted to start with the Cameroonian philosopher Akil Mbembe. And Mbembe says, speaking rationally about Africa is not something that has ever come naturally. Doing so at this cusp between millennia comes even less so. Yeah, that's swiped. The African human experience can only be understood through a negative interpretation. Africa is never seen as possessing things and attributes properly part of human nature. Or when it is, it's things that are attributed and generally are considered of lesser value, lesser importance, and poor quality. That's the baggage that comes to our discussion. It's this elementariness and primitiveness that makes Africa the world par excellence for all that is incomplete, mutilated, and unfinished. Its history reduced to a series of setbacks of nature in its quest for humankind. It's a really challenging context to step into as a designer from the north, from that side of the perspective, from that side of the coin. And so I just want to start there very humbly, talking about my work and my role as an American participating in African development. So with that in mind, a little bit of background. I spent about 5 years, the majority of my professional career prior to academia, practicing architecture at Deborah Burke and Partners in New York. It's a really exemplary architecture firm and very rigorous in its work, and it really built the foundation for my professional career. But I really went quickly from there to working as one of Architecture for Humanity's first design fellows, placed at the Youth with a Vision Community Center in northern South Africa. It was a collaboration between an NGO from Los Angeles and an NGO from South Africa with the intention of doing a children's village and community center on about 5 acres. I show this image because ultimately, and unfortunately, the project in many aspects failed. And it leaves us with this really important point or intention that I want to share, and that is that, that architecture in human development and in development in Africa, architecture is the face and the artifact of a multicultural engagement. When we go do work in Africa, the artifact of it is our architecture. And the African landscape is littered with really well-intended NGO buildings that are no longer in use. And it's an artifact of this failure and flawed perspective that we see in Mbembe's theories. There were also a lot of successes, and it was temporarily a successful project. But the question about how we create an enduring relationship between North and South remains. I went from there to doing a project for Dramatic Need. It's an NGO out of London that does arts therapy for township kids in rural South Africa. And we did the Pete Patzek Community Arts Center. There were a lot of lessons learned from my first round of experiences that resulted in a much more successful project here. And still today, this community arts center provides arts therapy for hundreds of kids each week. It wasn't long after that, through referrals, like many architects do, that I started doing research in urban environments, and particularly in the informal settlement of Alexandra Township in Johannesburg. Alex is about 1.5 square miles and about 500,000 people. It's one of the most dense contexts on Earth. And over 3 or 4 years, I worked with a community center there and took students back and forth, and we did some urban design research projects and community engagement methods. That also led to another research project in Kaya Sands, another informal settlement in Johannesburg. Also high density and really questionable issues of land ownership and real challenges of urban design. Since that time, then I started doing work for the Malawi Mission Hospital in Malawi. It's a 100-year-old mission institution, really successful. And that took me to the Fulbright, where I taught in the architecture program at the University of Malawi for the last year, and I returned in January. And really that buildup of all that work led me to the thesis for my Fulbright, which ultimately suggests that as the international donor community continues to do human development in Africa, it really needs to be Africans that are doing this work. And we need more African designers. And in this day and age, I've gotten to the point where I really feel strongly that the best thing I can do is support African institutions. That the institutions of Africa need to come up and gain resilience. So, with that as a background, I wanted to start by saying, when you think of Africa, what image comes to mind? Do you think of the thatched hut, rural African village? And what do you see? When you look at this image, do you see an image of impoverishment, or do you see a dynamic human landscape? And when you look at this, do you see the traditional vernacular thatched hut, or do you see the much more contemporary and moving forward perspective of a much more modern home here on the right with corrugated metal roofs? Big discussion in vernacular architecture in Africa is, wouldn't it be great if we all went back to thatched roofs? Nobody in rural Malawi wants a thatched roof. Everybody wants a corrugated metal roof. And what do we see about urban landscapes? Here's an image of Alex with extreme density. Or do we even see urban landscapes when we think of Africa, and do we see them as vibrant cities with high density? Or do we see them as a little more chaotic and out of control? Do we see them as pleasantly dense? And what do we see at the housing level? When you look at this image, do you see a shack, as is often the language that we discuss? Or do you see a rather resilient structure made up of, unfortunately, not the greatest of materials, but durable and watertight? And most importantly, do you see that even in this context of really challenged architecture and urbanity, do you see a well-maintained and rather dignified structure with somebody who's taking the time to make a small veranda, manage gardens, and manage their entry sequence into their home? And so one of the questions we have to ask is, what is our role of suggesting urban development in Africa when the last 60 years of our own urban development have been so challenged? What a blast. And so the real question is, how do we move forward here? And how can we remove our prejudices and judgments and really remove ourselves from the design process in such a way that we can really best serve African development. Trying to keep track on both sides here. And why do we get involved? Christian Benamana, the director of Mass Design Group's office in Kigali, said in a TED Talk recently they've done the math and determined that by 2050, Africa's population will double. It'll reach 2.5 billion people. And at this point, the African population will be slightly less than the current population of China and India. By that time, by 2050, it's estimated that we'll have to build 700 million more housing units in Africa. We'll have to build more than 300,000 schools and nearly 100,000 health centers. In other words, for the next 35 years, we have to build 7 health centers, 25 schools, and nearly 60,000 housing units every single day. So when we ask the question about why do we want to get involved, well, the first issue is need. In Malawi, where I've done this work, there are currently 41 registered architects in the country. One of them is the director of buildings for the government and a friend of mine, Terence Namona. I had dinner with Terence not too long ago, and I said, Terence, how many projects are in your office right now? And he said, we've got about 150. And I said, please tell me you have 150 people in your office. And he said, no. And I said, please tell me you have 15 people in your office. And he said, no, 5. So why do we get involved? Well, on a personal level, and this comes back to the sort of philosophical perspective again, and that's one of otherness, right? And I grew up in a small Midwestern town, utterly homogenous in its culture. And it's Ryszard Kapuściński's work that has always really inspired me. Kapuściński was a Polish news attaché, the first European news attaché in Africa. He followed the colonies as they fell through Nigeria and Ghana and West Africa and East Africa in particular. And he talks about his experience living in Africa at that time. And he says, others are the mirror in which I look at myself and which tells me who I am. When I lived in my own country, I was not aware that I am a white man and that this could have any significance for my fate. So for me, on a personal level, this back and forth opportunity is one for constant reflection. And it's important to remember that more than 80% of humans on the planet are not white. So why do we get involved as designers? Well, stepping into utterly foreign contexts makes us better designers. It keeps you really sharp. And Michael Murphy from Mass once said, an architect is always a foreigner. And I always really like that one because I also share that with my students, that every time we do a studio project and say, hey, let's design a school in Philadelphia, the second you say school, everybody snaps to an image of a school in the head that they've experienced before, right? But when you say a school in Africa, all of the contextual work related to design has to change. The climate's different, the culture's different, the spatial context and material context are all different. It really keeps you sharp if you want to do good work. And so why do we get involved on a professional level? Well, African urbanization will be one of the greatest challenges of humankind in the 21st century. New problems require new solutions, and we've got to figure out how to get involved. And I always thought, oops, I got something funny here. That when America developed, we had abundant resources, a tiny population, we had no economic competition, we were utterly spatially isolated, and we had superior firepower, unfortunately. But as Africa develops, the natural resources are already exploited and exported. They have a massive population, endless economic competition. It's an utterly globally integrated economy and very limited firepower. And so the total context of how we understand development in Africa needs to be different. We need to understand it differently than how the North developed. And one of the quotes that I really always enjoyed was Rem Koolhaas's perspective on their research in Lagos that you see in Mutations. And that's that Koolhaas says, we're resisting the notion that Lagos represents an African city en route to becoming modern. And ultimately what he argues is Lagos is not catching up with us, but rather we are catching up with Lagos. Lagos is a very dynamic city with over 1,000 people a day arriving at it. It's got 30 million people in the greater metropolitan area, and it is not going to develop in the way that the States has developed. So what do we do as designers as we start to understand a future that we have that is rather unpredictable? What will the cities of the future look like? And I'm not talking about the Elon Musk $70,000 car technological fix here. I'm talking about real cities, real people, real lives. Limited technologies, limited materials, limited government capacity, limited economic opportunity. And how do they experience the development of their country with all of these unimaginable external forces applied to it? So I wanted to talk a bit about the work I've been doing in Malawi. Oops, my timer. There we go. So for the past 5 years, I've been doing work in Malawi. It's this fantastically beautiful, long, slender country in a little bit of Southern Africa and a little bit of East Africa. Often people joke if you're ever on safari that it's a flyover country because people are on safari in Tanzania and they're on safari in South Africa and Zambia, and everybody just seems to be hopping over Malawi. It's kind of like Iowa. But Malawi today is pretty interesting. It's a little bit behind the real chaos of some of these other contexts like Luanda, Kinshasa, Johannesburg, Nairobi. Malawi's development is behind and their population explosion is behind. Another way to look at it is that it's a really good opportunity to get in front of some really massive foreboding challenges. The biggest issue is rural to urban migration. We're experiencing it all over the world. Rural to urban migration in Malawi is currently at about 6% annually, but it's on its way to 10%. Malawi has a population of about 17 million people. There are two large cities, Lilongwe and Blantyre, that make up, Lilongwe's got about 1.8 million people in it, Blantyre has about 1.5 million in it. But as rural to urban migration happens, those two cities are going to more than double in population in the next 30 years. Deforestation rates in Malawi are at 8% annually. The number one cause of deforestation is cooking fuel. 95% of all cooking in Malawi is done over charcoal. But the number two cause of it is bush bricks. Bush bricks are insanely sustainable in many ways. The soil has enough clay content in it that you can make bricks from your job site, stack them into a kiln, and fire them and end up with very durable bricks. No cement content. But the material for the firing is wood, and it leads to massive amounts of deforestation in the country. Public electricity in October, when I was living in Blantyre, we had power about 30% of the week. The other 70% you're without power. 95% of all power in the country is hydroelectric. There's a big rainy season from January to June, and then it stops raining. And until it starts raining again, the power just continues to decrease in frequency. Infrastructure is utterly overwhelmed, and that also leads to some dynamic opportunities. This was a really interesting case where outside of Blantyre, they intended to build 4 lanes. They ran out of money and really only built 2 lanes for vehicular traffic. And the next thing you start to see is that everybody from Kachiri, the township outside of town, started using that whole second set of lanes as a pedestrian corridor. And you see thousands of people walking down the world's widest sidewalk every day. It's really It's really quite fantastic. And of course, this all leads to massive healthcare challenges. Pennsylvania and Malawi by population in 2014 were rather close in size. The primary care providers in Pennsylvania were about 10,000, and in Malawi were 190. That means the people per primary care provider is about 2,000 to 80,000. The number of surgeons is 3,300 to 31, and the people per surgeon is about 3,700 to 500,000. So with healthcare is a real challenge. Of course, this issue of rural to urban migration and public housing and informal settlements is another massive issue in the country. And so I just wanted to point out one of the informal settlements, as they say. Informality in Malawi is different than informality other places on Earth. In other places we call, some places we call them slums, some places we call them shanty towns or favelas. In Malawi, informal settlements are high-density contexts with ambiguous legality with regard to land ownership. But the houses themselves tend to be rather safe in nature. They're usually built out of brick. The house is usually fine. Circulation networks, sanitation networks, water networks, power networks, all of those are a total disaster. And this is an interesting image. So this is Blantyre, Malawi. Here is downtown Blantyre, the urban center, full of lots of 5- and 6-story buildings, pretty normative in nature. And here is Ndurandi. Ndurandi is the largest informal settlement in the country. There are 250,000 people living in Ndurandi. And just to back off, again, here's downtown Blantyre. Here's Ndurandi, Imbayani, Chilimoni, these massive high-density centers on the periphery of the core. Really challenging environment to try to consider circulation, power, infrastructure, all these things that if the density is in the core, it's much easier to manage. When you zoom in even further into Ndurandi, the Ndurandi market has 30,000 employees in it, almost all operating informally. And so as we start to move forward understanding these urban challenges and healthcare challenges, one of the things I've been working on for the last couple of years is the development of a research center called the Malawi Center for Health and Design. And this transitions into the work that I'm doing here. And so as we build this center, what we're trying to do is build enduring relationships and not just one-off projects. Really create sustainable partnerships with global perspectives, local institutions, and academic leaders, and really strengthening the institutions in the country. What we're trying to do is bring together healthcare providers and designers in these contexts, and in particular, in regard to hospitals, hospitals desperately need more designers playing a role. And so we're really trying to connect teaching and research and practice, collaborating with academic institutions, including the College of Medicine in Malawi and the College of Architecture and the Urban Environment. And what we're really trying to do is start to aim at targeting global goals, including the United Nations Development Goals, World Health Organization goals, targets of that nature that we can pursue projects through. And we believe that there's a real nexus, a symbiotic relationship in this context between health, public health, and design. So we started collaborations with the Kamuzu Central Hospital and the Queen Elizabeth Central Hospital. They're the two biggest hospitals in the country. The Malamulo Hospital, which I've been doing work with for 5 years, is the largest hospital in the southern part of the country. And then the University of Malawi's College of Medicine, College of Built Environment, and government collaborators as well. And there are two real tracks to that work that we've been focused on. The first track is improving healthcare by design. And that stream leverages clinical and quality improvement research in hospital contexts to improve healthcare delivery. I just want to give one anecdote about that work, and that is that the surgery theater at the Kamuzu Central Hospital, biggest hospital in the country, is closed 3 to 4 days every month because they don't have a steady supply of running water. When a doctor says, hey, we don't have a steady supply of running water, everybody says, yeah, that's a pain. Wouldn't that be great if we could do something about it? When a designer walks into that context, the designer walks in and says, hey, it rains like crazy 5 months of the year. We could capture a whole bunch of rainwater, filter it, store it. You could be using cisterns and refilling those cisterns even if it's not raining, and have a resilient supply of running water. When an architect says that to people, everybody pats you on the head and says, wow, that's really nice, but who's going to pay for it, right? But when an architect and a surgeon go to the World Health Organization and say, hey, we're tracking surgeries, we're canceling this many cases every month, and we think if we just had a steady supply of running water, we could increase our surgery theater performance by 7% annually, and that's going to save lives. And how much does it cost? Well, it costs about $500,000, and we already have a design in place. You hand that to the World Health Organization, and World Health Organization says, you said $500,000? Take $1 million and make sure you get it right. The other big issue is housing for hospitals. And so we're doing a project with the Malawi Mission Hospital. In these rural contexts, hospitals really struggle for retention. And so keeping doctors at hospitals is a big deal. So right now, quite literally as we speak, there are houses under construction for doctors that students and I have designed. Over the last 5 years, my students and I have done a number of different design projects for the Malawi Mission Hospital, including a resilient master plan, clinical teaching center, which is on the books. Guardian housing is being designed as we speak. The Guardian plays a really critical role in Malawi's healthcare. The Guardian is a person who comes with you to the hospital. That person is almost always a woman. She cooks, cleans, does light bandage replacement and other light medical services for you, and needs some place to stay while you're in the hospital. The Malawi Hospital is an 80-hectare complex. It's really quite an amazing institution. These are the current Guardian houses that are really rather unhospitable. And so it's students and I that are designing these projects as we speak. There's also doctors' housing. This is the site of 8 doctors' houses that are under construction now. Oop, and there we go, way too much time. Kamuzu Central Hospital, biggest hospital in the country, 220 acres. I took a drone, scanned the entire complex, and we're doing a master plan for KCH as well. They have a lot of challenges in place with regard to typically every construction they do for a new ward is a one-off project where they kind of point and say, okay, let's do a cancer center there. But they don't have a master plan in place. So my next studio this fall, in collaboration with our geodesign students and our landscape architecture students, is to work through a master plan for this hospital. And again, I took a drone and did an entire scan of the 220 acres. It's the first time they've had a full civil survey of the property. It's really amazing technology and very powerful, and that's leading to a number of projects, including some transportation and circulation network design, new performance issues in the trauma theater and the ward. This is the emergency room. One of the last things I'll mention about this one, really interesting, they call them mass casualty incidents. If an Amtrak train crashes in this region and 40 people are injured, they probably get distributed 5 per hospital to 8 different hospitals in the region, right? In Malawi, mass trauma incident. If 2 minibuses crash, you end up with 26 dying people showing up in the same emergency ward, often in the back of a pickup truck. So how do these spaces start to flex and change with really challenged staffing and facilities, right? It's a real context where the architecture of hospitals has a very big impact on performance and saving lives. So these are some projects. One of the other things that's really interesting, again, this is all of the guardians hanging out at the pediatric ward with kids in the peds ward. And so how do we understand all of these sort of migratory people who are just hanging out in hospitals, right? And in our environment, you'd never see anything like this. And it's not the worst thing in the world. It's actually quite humane and sort of nice to have all of these people around, but figuring out how to make space for them is really challenging. And that right there is the main outpatient lobby right next to this traffic zone. So how do we understand this spatial environment in a way that can make these hospitals perform much better? And then I'll just zip through that the second track. So the first track of this research center is around hospitals. The second track is around public health and informal settlements. And again, what we see is that in informal settlements, social indicators of health are often spatial. For example, we see malaria outbreaks and cholera outbreaks in informal settlements more than any other places. Those pertain directly to sanitation and water systems. So while in the past, public health people were studying cholera and malaria, and designers were studying sanitation and water, what we hope is that this research center will bring people together to work on these projects collaboratively. These are images of informal settlements and some of my students in Malawi doing community engagement, methodology, design work in Bangwe. Here are a series of student projects in these contexts, and what we're really hoping is that we can get students and faculty and researchers going back and forth working on projects there. And so to conclude, what role can we play in Africa? Well, I think it's a human one. And how do we understand Africa? Well, ultimately, it's humans navigating a complex and multicultural world, where definitions of self are less informed by history and more informed by the manner in which we engage others. I think that's the future of African development, and maybe there's a way that we can play a role. Thank you.